The morning Calvin Granger found the orc woman in his barley field, half buried beneath a collapsed fence rail and bleeding into the frost-hardened earth, was the morning his quiet, solitary life cracked open like a seed breaking ground, and something entirely unexpected began to grow. He had risen before the sun, as farmers do, with the particular kind of weariness that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with years. At 28, Calvin was not old, but the land had a way of pressing itself into a man's bones, of settling into the lines around his eyes and the permanent roughness of his palms. He had inherited the Granger homestead from his father 3 years past, and it was a modest place, 30 acres of workable soil at the eastern edge of the Veldmore frontier, far enough from the nearest town of Ashwick that his nearest neighbor was a half-day's walk through scrub pine and limestone ridge. He had a log cabin, a small barn, 2 draft horses named Mare and Biscuit, and a dog named Fig who had gone deaf in his right ear from a thunderclap 2 summers prior. It was a hard life, but it was his, and Calvin Granger was a man who loved the things that were his with a quiet, stubborn ferocity. He spotted the shape in the barley from the edge of the field, and for a moment his mind offered him a bear. They came down from the Keld Ridge sometimes in the lean months, but the shape was wrong. Too angular, too still. Fig had frozen at Calvin's heel, a low sound catching in the dog's throat, and Calvin had put his hand down to settle him before taking the 3 slow steps that brought him close enough to see. She was an orc woman, and she was not small. Even curled on her side with one arm pinned beneath the collapsed fence post, and the other hand pressed flat against the frozen ground as though trying to push herself up, she was formidable. Her skin was the color of deep river moss, dark and green-gray, and her black hair had come loose from some braid arrangement and lay in a tangled mass across the barley stalks beside her face. Her lower canines curved upward in the slight tusk-like protrusion common to orc women, less pronounced than in the men, but present and visible. She wore a rough-spun traveling cloak that had once been dark red and was now mostly mud, leather armor beneath it that had taken a hard impact somewhere. There was a dent in the left pauldron like someone had struck it with a hammer, and her boots were the kind that said she had walked very, very far. She was also, he realized with a start, looking directly at him. Her eyes were amber, shot through with darker striations, and they were very awake and very wary. She had not made a sound as he approached. She had been watching him, calculating. Calvin stopped. He held both hands open at his sides. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The amber eyes did not blink. "My name is Calvin Granger. This is my farm. You are in my barley field, and you have a fence post on your arm, and you are bleeding." He paused. "I have a cabin, I have a fire, I have a wife who—" He stopped himself. He had not meant to say that, he breathed. "I have bandages and food." Something shifted behind her eyes. A recalculation. "I don't need charity," she said. Her voice was low and rough, accented in the way of someone who had learned the common tongue as a second language, every consonant slightly heavier than it needed to be. "I need you to lift the post." "All right," Calvin said. He walked to the fence post without ceremony, crouched, and got his hands under it. It was heavier than it looked, waterlogged from the rains 3 days past, and the effort required was real, but he lifted it and set it aside. She pulled her arm free, and the sound she made as she did so was not quite a gasp and not quite a growl, but something between a controlled exhalation that carried pain inside it like a fist inside a glove. She got one knee under herself, then stopped. Calvin watched her try again. Watched the arm, her left arm, the pinned one, fail to take her weight properly, something in her shoulder. He did not offer a second time. He simply stepped forward, crouched to her level, and said quietly, "Put your good arm around my neck." For a long moment she only looked at him. There was a tension in her jaw, a pride in her expression that was as readable as any human face Calvin had ever seen. It was the face of someone who had learned, in hard ways, that accepting help was a door through which very bad things could enter. But the arm came around his neck. He got her upright. She was taller than him by nearly 2 inches and solidly built, muscle and bone, and the kind of physical density that spoke of a life lived in constant physical demand. But she was also clearly not at her best, and she allowed his steadying hand at her ribs as they moved very slowly across the frozen field toward the cabin. Fig walked ahead of them, his single good ear swiveled all the way back, uncertain about the whole business. "What is your name?" Calvin asked as they walked. A pause. Another calculation. "Vrogash," she said. "Vrogash Stormbound." He let her rest in the old chair by the hearth, the one his father had built from ash wood and which was still the sturdiest thing in the cabin. He put more wood on the fire. He did not pepper her with questions. He filled a pot with water and set it to heat, and he found his linen bandaging and the clay pot of wound salve his neighbor Marta Hensley had pressed on him last spring. Vrogash watched him do all of this with those amber eyes. Watched the way he moved in his own space, unhurried, organized, without the performance of helpfulness that she had learned to distrust. Men who performed helpfulness usually wanted something from it. This man moved the way a person moved when they were simply doing what needed doing. "The salve will sting," Calvin said, pulling a stool close and sitting at her level. "I know what salve is," Vrogash said. "Right, good." He held out his hand. She looked at it, then at him. Then slowly she extended her left arm. The shoulder was not dislocated, a small mercy, but the muscle beneath the armor had been badly compressed, and there was a long graze along the back of her forearm where the post's edge had torn through the cloak and bitten into skin. Calvin worked carefully, cleaning the wound with the heated water and a cloth, applying salve, wrapping the bandage with the neat, practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 years patching himself up alone. She did not flinch. She watched his face instead of her arm. "How long were you in the field?" he asked. "Since before dark last night." He looked up at that. The night had been cold enough to be dangerous. "You didn't call out?" "No." He went back to the bandaging. He tied it off cleanly and sat back on the stool. "There is a reason you didn't call for help." It was not a question, and Vrogash did not answer it as one. "I was not certain what kind of help I would get." Calvin nodded slowly. He understood. He was not naive about the world, about what could happen to an orc woman alone on the frontier, injured, unable to run. He had grown up in Ashwick, and he knew the way men in that town talked about the orc clans that came through sometimes during the migration seasons, knew the way words could curdle into violence with very little provocation. "You are safe here," he said. "You can stay until you're steady on your feet." Vrogash looked at him for a long time. "You do not know me," she said. "No," Calvin agreed. "But I know what it is to be hurt and alone, and I know what the right thing to do is. My father was very clear on that point." He stood, moved to the small pantry, and pulled out a hard loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese and a string of dried sausages that were maybe 4 days from being past their best. "Eat. The sausages are better if you don't think too hard about them." For the first time, the wariness in her face cracked, just slightly. It was not a smile, but it was something adjacent to one. She stayed 3 days. The shoulder kept her down more than her pride wanted to admit, and on the first night she slept in the ash chair by the fire, and Calvin slept in his loft with Fig curled at his feet, and neither of them made a point of it. On the second day she was upright and moving through the cabin with a careful, controlled gait that he recognized as someone forcing themselves to appear less hindered than they were. He did not comment on it. He gave her work instead, light work, the kind that required hands and not shoulders, and she sat at the table and helped him sort the dried corn kernels that he was keeping for seed, and talk came, gradually, the way it does when 2 people share a task without the pressure of facing each other. He learned she had been traveling from the eastern reaches, from a place called the Greywood, where her clan, the Stormbound, had maintained territory for 4 generations. She did not say why she had left, not directly, but she said the word clan with the very particular weight of someone who has been cast out of something, and Calvin had the sense to hear what was not being said. She learned that he had taken the farm after his father, Calvin Granger, died of a fever in the third winter that followed the Veldmore settlement expansion. That his mother had gone back to her sister in the coastal city of Drenmarch and had wanted Calvin to come with her. But he had looked at the 30 acres and the log cabin and the 2 horses and decided that this was something worth holding onto. That he had been engaged once 2 years ago to a woman named Sira Mallow from Ashwick, and that she had decided the frontier life was not for her and he had not held it against her. "You do not seem like a man who holds things against people," Vrogash observed on the afternoon of the second day. Calvin considered this. "I try not to. Resentment is heavy. Farming is already heavy enough." On the third day she helped him mend the fence. He had not asked her to. She simply appeared beside him in the morning with the post driver in her good hand and an expression that dared him to suggest she couldn't manage it. She could manage it fine. Better than him, actually. The orc physical advantage was real, and she drove posts with an efficiency and power that Calvin found himself genuinely admiring, not in the way of someone cataloging something strange, but in the way of someone watching any skilled laborer work and feeling the clean satisfaction of watching competence in action. "You have done this before," he said. "Clan fencing," she said. "We ran cattle." A pause, the post driver swinging again. "The clan runs cattle." Calvin handed her the next post without comment. By evening the fence line was solid and she was ready to leave. He could see it in her, the gathering of herself, the reassembly of the wariness that had slightly, only slightly, softened over 3 days. "Where are you going?" he asked, not challengingly, just honestly. "West," she said. "There is an orc settlement near Copperstone, 3 days' walk." He nodded. He looked at the sky. Then he said, "The storm that's been building over the Keld Ridge is going to break tonight or tomorrow morning. You can see it in the clouds." She looked. She could see it. "You could wait it out," he said. "Leave after." She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he looked back at her with his gray ones, and something moved between them in the early evening air that was not yet named and was not yet claimed but was unmistakably there. "You need more help with that barley," she said. "I do," he agreed. She put the post driver down and walked back to the cabin, and Fig waddled after her, because in 3 days he had apparently decided that Vrogash Stormbound was an acceptable addition to his life, and Calvin Granger stood alone in the cooling air by the mended fence and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound for a very long time. She did not leave after the storm. The storm itself was considerable, 3 days of hard rain that turned the fields to mud and kept them both mostly indoors. Calvin's cabin was not large. It was one main room with the hearth and the table and the 2 chairs, his father's ash chair that he had given to her and a newer one he had built himself, and a loft for sleeping and a small cold pantry at the back. 2 people in that space was intimate in the way that frontier spaces often are, without ceremony or decoration, every inch of shared territory negotiated through small, daily gestures. He learned that she ground her own herbs for tea, bitter things that smelled of pine resin and something sharper, and that she made it strong enough to strip paint and drank it without any visible discomfort. He learned that she could read, not a thing all travelers could do, and that she had a folded piece of paper in her breast pocket that she would sometimes take out and look at in the evenings, though she never opened it in front of him. She learned that he woke before dawn without a clock or rooster prompting him, and that the first thing he did every morning was check the sky from the door and then start the fire, and that he hummed while he worked, tuneless and unconscious, the way a person does when they forget they are not alone. She learned that he had a small shelf of books above his sleeping loft, 4 of them, battered and well used, and that he would read a few pages each night before sleeping, and that he always left a bookmark precisely placed, never dog-earing a page, a detail she found unexpectedly revealing about his character. On the second evening of the storm she asked him about the books. He brought them down, an almanac of Veldmore growing seasons, a natural history of the eastern frontier flora and fauna, a collection of surveying charts and land measurement guides, and a slim volume of verse that looked entirely out of place among the others. She picked up the verse. "This was my mother's," Calvin said. Vrogash turned it over in her hands. The cover was worn soft as cloth. She liked poetry. She said it kept the practical parts of her brain from swallowing the rest. He paused. "I mostly read it when I can't sleep. Does it work? Not really, but it's nice anyway." She opened to a page at random and read silently, her lips not moving, her expression thoughtful. Then she looked up. "The orc oral tradition has something like this," she said. "We call it the binding song. Each clan has its own. Ours, the Stormbound ours, begins with a storm on the Greywood Plains, the first storm of the world, and our ancestors running into it instead of away from it." She paused. "That is where the name comes from. Your people run toward storms." "Stormbound," she confirmed, and for the first time in his presence she said it without the weight of exile beneath it. She said it like pride. The rain drummed on the roof. "Tell me more," Calvin said, and she did. She talked for almost 2 hours, in the low firelight with the rain making its percussion on the shingles, and Calvin sat across the table and listened the way he did everything completely, without interrupting, with an attention that was not performance but genuine presence. She told him about the Greywood, about the vast swaying grassland that gave way to ancient forest along the eastern edges, about the clan camps that moved with the seasons. She told him about her mother, Vrogash Stormbound, who had been the clan's war-caller, a position of counsel and wisdom, and who had died 8 years past from a sickness that came in from the trading routes. She told him about her older brother Gort, who had taken poorly to the grief and poorly to the clan leadership that followed. And she told him, finally, with the particular careful flatness of someone choosing their words very precisely, that she had spoken against a decision Gort had made in council, that the decision had involved a trade agreement with a human merchant group that she believed was extracting more than it gave. That Gort had not taken the dissent well. "Clan law," she said, "gives the headkin authority to ask a dissenting voice to seek their purpose elsewhere." She looked at the fire. "It is not banishment, technically." "Technically," Calvin said. "Technically," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I am sorry, that sounds like a tremendous loss." She looked at him, the sharp, instinctive look of someone waiting for a caveat but for the well, clans are strange, or I suppose they do things differently. No caveat came. "It is," she said, "the worst kind, the kind where you are still alive but the thing you belong to is gone." Calvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "Yes, I know that kind." He was thinking of Sira Mallow, she thought, or of his father perhaps, or of something else entirely. But she heard in his voice the thing she had heard very rarely in anyone's voice when she had spoken of her exile. She heard recognition, not sympathy performing itself, recognition. She went to bed the loft, because on the 3rd night he had insisted and taken the ash chair himself and lay in the dark listening to the rain, and to Fig's snoring and to Calvin's quiet breathing from below, and she pressed her hand flat against the wooden floor of the loft, the way she had pressed it against the frozen ground in the barley field, and she thought about what it meant to find a place where you could set your hand down and feel something solid. She stayed another week, then another. Then the barley needed harvesting. She would not have admitted, if asked directly, that this was why she stayed. She would have said, and it was true, that the barley harvest on a one-man farm was brutal work, that Calvin needed help, that she was rested now and her shoulder was whole and she was a hard worker who paid what she owed. All of this was true. It was also true that the mornings had become something she was reluctant to leave behind. The fire, the tea, the tuneless humming. Fig's deaf-ear confusion at the sound of her footstep on that side. The way Calvin would look up from whatever he was doing when she came in or out, and say something brief and practical that somehow never felt impersonal, saying good morning like it meant something specific about this particular morning and her particular presence in it. They worked through the harvest together. It took 9 days. Long days, physically demanding in ways that left them both aching by evening, but the work had its own rhythm, and that rhythm carried them together into something easy and close. He taught her his particular method of binding the sheaves, different from the clan method, more compact, better suited to his drying barn. She showed him an orc harvesting technique for the hedgerows that prevented the grain loss that had been frustrating him at the field edges. They argued briefly and productively about the best way to stack the barn, and both of them turned out to be partly right. On the seventh evening of the harvest, with a good portion of the grain in and the light going gold and long across the fields, Calvin sat down at the edge of the field and pulled out his canteen, and Vrogash sat beside him, and for a while they just breathed together in the particular comfortable silence of shared labor. "You are a good farmer," she said. "I am a stubborn farmer," he said. "There's a difference." "Not as much as you think." He handed her the canteen and she drank and handed it back. "My father would have liked you," he said. She looked at him. He liked people who worked hard and thought straight and did not make a lot of noise about themselves. Calvin turned the canteen in his hands. He was also the sort of man who would say that the only honest politics is the kind you practice at the dinner table. He was suspicious of larger things. "He sounds like a pragmatist." "He was the most pragmatic man I've ever known. He also cried at the verse sometimes when my mother read it aloud." Calvin paused. "People are contradictions." Vrogash looked at the long gold light on the field, at the barley they had cut together, at the barn growing full. "My mother sang the binding song every morning before dawn," she said. "Not the whole thing, just the opening verse. She said it set the day in the right direction." She paused. "I have not sung it since she died. I have not felt like I had the right to it these past years." Calvin said nothing. He waited. "I think I remember it," she said softly. "All of it." "Then it's still yours," Calvin said. "Whether you sing it or not, it belongs to you." She looked at him with those amber eyes in the golden light, and something in her chest did something complicated and warm and frightening. He looked back at her with his gray eyes steady as limestone. "Vrogash," he said quietly. "Calvin," she said with equal quietness. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them needed to. He did not reach for her hand. She did not lean toward him. But something between them settled, the way a decision settles before it is spoken, like grain filling the hollow of a waiting cup. The 9th day finished the harvest, and that evening was the first evening she helped him cook supper, orc-style spiced lentils with smoked pork that he had in the cold pantry. A dish that was neither fully her tradition nor fully his, but something that came from both, and it was very good. They ate at the table together, and Fig sat beside Vrogash's chair because Fig was no longer uncertain about anything, and Calvin poured a small cup of the apple brandy he kept for winters and poured one for her too, and raised his cup. "To the harvest," he said. "To the harvest," she echoed. They drank. "Will you stay through winter?" he asked. Direct. No performance, just the question. She set her cup down. She thought of the orc settlement near Copperstone, 3 days west. She thought of the Greywood. She thought of Gort and the council and the technical non-banishment. She thought of the piece of folded paper in her breast pocket, which was a letter from her cousin Prita that she had not been able to fully read since she left, because finishing it felt too much like closing a door. "I don't want charity," she said. The same words as the first day, but softer now, worn smooth by context. "I know," Calvin said. "I am not offering charity. I'm asking if you'll stay." He paused. "I am asking because this farm is too much for one person and I am tired of doing it alone. I'm also asking because—" He stopped, a brief, genuine struggle with words. "Because the mornings are better since you've been here. The days are better." He looked at the table. "I don't know how else to say it." Vrogash was quiet for a long time. "I will stay through winter," she said, "and we will see." Calvin Granger nodded, and the thing in his chest that had been tightly wound loosened another full turn. "Good," he said. Winter came hard to the Veldmore frontier. It always did. The Keld Ridge funneled the northern winds down across the plateau, and the temperature dropped with a speed and severity that the southern farming regions never experienced. And the snow came in waves. 3 days of heavy fall, 2 days of clear bitter cold, another wave of snow. Calvin's cabin was well insulated, chinked with clay and moss and packed with the knowledge of his father's 3 years in it before him. And the woodpile was good because Calvin spent the whole of autumn building it. cutting and splitting on the days between other work with a methodical dedication that Vrogash had, by October, begun to assist with. She was extraordinarily good with an axe. This did not surprise Calvin, but it did impress him, which was different. He told her so directly, and she told him the Stormbound had a tradition of axe work that went back centuries, that the young of the clan learned to split wood before they learned most other things, and that her form was only middling by clan standards. "I would like to see the Stormbound's best," Calvin said. "No," she said, with the first truly open smile he had seen from her, showing the curve of her tusks and the warmth behind them. "You would not. It is deeply humbling." The winter found them in a rhythm. It was a very different kind of closeness than the harvest, less physical labor, more time in the cabin, more evenings by the fire, more of the particular intimacy of two people learning each other's habits and fits. Calvin learned that Vrogash woke sometimes in the night, not with nightmares exactly, but with a wakefulness that sent her to sit by the banked fire and stare into the coals for an hour before returning to the loft. He learned this because on the third such occasion the sound of her moving had woken him, and he had come down from the loft and simply sat in his father's chair with her and not said anything, and she had not told him to go back to sleep. So they sat together in the ember glow, and after a while she told him about Greywood winters, about the way the clan would gather in the long hall and tell stories through the dark months, how the binding song was sung in rounds with different voices carrying different parts. "It sounds like the harvest festivals in Ashwick," Calvin said. "When I was young, the whole town would crowd into the miller's barn, and there would be music and eating until the middle of the night." He paused. "I haven't been to Ashwick in over a year. Do you miss it?" He thought genuinely about this. "I miss the noise of it, the feeling of other people, but I never quite fit in Ashwick even when I lived there." "I am better here," he glanced at her. "I am better here now." She looked at the coals. Then she opened the folded letter. She had never done this in front of him before, and he sat very still, not wanting to disturb the moment. She read it in full in the amber coal light, her face carefully composed. When she finished, she refolded it exactly along its original creases. "My cousin Prita," she said. "She says Gort has softened somewhat since I left. That the trade agreement I objected to has proven to be as unfavorable as I said it would be." She paused. "She says there may be a path back, eventually, if I wanted one." Calvin said nothing. "I do not know if I want one," Vrogash said. "I did not know when I left what I was walking toward. I only knew I was not going to unmake myself to stay." She folded the letter and placed it in her breast pocket again. "I think I needed to find out who I was when I was not Stormbound of the Greywood, just Vrogash." "And?" Calvin asked softly. She looked at him across the hearth. The coals made amber light on her face, exactly the color of her eyes, and she was beautiful in a way that still caught in his throat when he was not prepared for it. Not in spite of her orc features, but with them, wholly, in the specific combination of her face and her strength and the quality of her attention. "And I think she is someone I can live with," Vrogash said quietly. Calvin reached across and put his hand over hers on the arm of the ash chair. She looked down at his hand. Then she turned hers over beneath his and held it. They stayed like that until the coals went gray. December brought word from Ashwick. A trader named Bors Callan, who made the frontier rounds in a horse-drawn, covered wagon, came through on the south road within hailing distance of the farm, and Calvin went out to meet him for news and supplies. Calvin had known Bors for years. He was a practical man, stout and weather-beat, the kind of trader who saw everything and said only what was necessary and never cheated on his weights. Bors sold him salt and lamp oil and a bolt of wool cloth, and then said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering something he was uncertain how to deliver, "Heard you had a guest out here, Calvin." "A farmhand," Calvin said. "She's been helping with the harvest and winter work." Bors adjusted his hat. "An orc. Her name is Vrogash Stormbound," Calvin said. "She is the best axe worker I've seen in my life, and she can smell a coming storm 2 days out. I consider myself fortunate." Boris looked at him for a moment, then shrugged the shrug of a man who has found that the world contains more varieties of arrangement than he was initially prepared for. "There's talk in Ashwick," he said. "Not everyone is warm on it." "There is talk in Ashwick about everything," Calvin said. "How is the blacksmith's knee?" Boris accepted the subject change with another shrug. "Better, they say." Calvin took his supplies back to the farm and did not mention the conversation to Vrogash that evening. He mentioned it 2 days later when she asked him directly why he had been quiet. He told her the truth, the whole of it, without softening it. She deserved that. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I know how this looks to people in Ashwick, to people anywhere. I have had that look all my life. Everywhere I have gone in the human frontier, I have had that look, the assessing look, the is she dangerous look." She paused. "I am used to it." "You should not have to be," Calvin said. "Perhaps not, but I am." She looked at him. "Are you used to it?" He thought about it honestly. "No, but I will learn to be, if that is what this requires." There was a steadiness in the way he said it. Not bravado, not the sweeping declaration of a man who had not yet understood what he was saying, but the measured, deliberate tone of a man who had thought it through and meant it. Vrogash looked at him for a long moment. "This," she said quietly, "whatever this is, what is it, Calvin? What do you think it is?" He held her gaze. "I think it is the most important thing that has happened to me in many years. I think it is you, and I think it is me, and I think it is this farm and this winter and the evenings by the fire, and I think I would like it to keep going." He paused. "I think I am in love with you. I am fairly certain I have been for 2 months. I am telling you now because you asked." Silence. Then Vrogash crossed the distance between them, 3 steps, and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him with amber eyes very close, and he could see everything in them. The wariness still present, but behind it something vast and warm and real. "I do not say these words lightly," she said. "I am not built for light words. You should know this." "I know it," Calvin said. "I have been trying to convince myself for weeks that I was not feeling what I was feeling," she said. "Because you are human and I am orc, and the world does not arrange things well for people like us." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't. And I stayed anyway," she said. "You stayed anyway," he confirmed. Her hands against his face were warm and strong and careful. He put his hands over hers, the same gesture he had made at the hearth, but closer now, more deliberate. "I love this farm," Vrogash said. "I love this ridiculous half-deaf dog. I love the mornings, a breath. I love you, Calvin Granger." He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and she made a sound low in her throat, not quite a word, not quite a sound he had heard from her before. It was a deep, resonant sound, felt as much as heard, something that came from her chest and vibrated in the air between them. "What does that growl mean?" he asked softly against her palm. She pulled back just enough to look at his face, and what was in her expression then was something he would carry for the rest of his life, something open and fierce and certain and very, very warm. "It means I'm keeping you," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and then she was laughing too, and it was so rare and full a sound from her that it made Fig startle upright on his rug, looking between them with his one hearing ear cocked hard. Calvin Granger pulled Vrogash Stormbound close, and she let herself be pulled, and outside the snow was coming in the low quiet way of deep winter, and the fire was good, and the farm was still and sound, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Spring came, and with it complication. He had known it would. Any man who had lived 30 years in this world and paid attention to it knew that happiness has a weight, and that other people tend to notice when someone carries more of it than they are accustomed to. Word had spread through the frontier circuit, these things always spread, along the same routes as traded goods, and on the first warm week of March, a group of 3 men came riding up the south road and turned into Calvin Granger's property. Calvin was mending the east paddock gate when he heard the horses. He straightened, shaded his eyes, and watched them come. He recognized 2 of them, Renner Dale, who ran a supply house in Ashwick and had been a decade older than Calvin his whole life, always with an opinion ready to issue, and his brother Silas, who was large and quiet in the particular way of men who prefer their size to do their talking. The third man Calvin did not know, a younger man with the kind of new-to-the-frontier look that showed in his still-clean coat. Vrogash was behind the barn. Calvin knew this because she had been breaking ground in the new kitchen garden plot, and he had the brief, sharp thought that he hoped she stayed there, followed immediately and with more force by the thought that he had no right to hope any such thing, and she could be wherever she chose. The men dismounted at the paddock fence. "Calvin," Renner said, with the tone of a man doing a disagreeable duty he has assigned himself, "we've come to talk sense." "I enjoy sense," Calvin said pleasantly. "Come to the point." Renner's expression tightened. "The orc woman, you've had her on your property all winter. People are concerned." "Which people?" "People in Ashwick. The Hendersons, the mill council, she is my farmhand," Calvin said. "She is employed on my property. My property, Renner, which is half a day from Ashwick and which has not, to my knowledge, concerned the Henderson family before." "It's not decent," Silas offered, speaking as predicted. "She lives in my home," Calvin said. "She works the land alongside me. She has been here through the winter and intends to stay through spring and summer. I do not see what is indecent about that." "She is an orc," the young man said, as though this settled everything. Calvin looked at him steadily. "She is a person. She has a name. Her name is Vrogash Stormbound, and she is, I will tell you directly, the finest human being, and I use that word in full knowledge of its limits, the finest person I have ever had the privilege of knowing." He paused. "If that is a problem for you, you are welcome to ride back the way you came." Renner Dale looked at him with the look of a man who had come prepared for many reactions and not this particular one. "Calvin, your father was a respected man. This is your inheritance." "My father," Calvin said, "was a man who would have sat that woman down at his table and fed her and asked her about her clan and listened to every word she said. I know this because he raised me to be the same. Do not put his name in an argument he would have been on my side of." A long silence. "There will be more than talk," Renner said, not quite a threat but carrying the shape of one. "There may be," Calvin acknowledged. "And when that comes I will handle it. Right now I need to finish this gate." "Good day, Renner." He turned back to the gate. He heard the horses turn, eventually, and the sound of them receding down the south road, and he kept working the gate until he could not hear them any more. Then he put down the tools and sat on the fence rail and let his hands shake for a moment privately before steadying them. When he came around the corner of the barn, Vrogash was standing 12 feet away with the garden fork in her hands and her amber eyes very still. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. He walked to her and stopped in front of her. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it, for the fact that they came at all, for the fact that this is the world." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and put one hand flat against his chest, over his heart, the way she had pressed her hand to the ground in the barley field, feeling for something solid. "You did not apologize for me," she said. "You did not explain me or excuse me or minimize me." "No," he said, "of course not." She pressed her hand harder against his chest. "That matters more than you know." "I think I am beginning to know," he said. Spring became their season after that, in the way that specific times of year become attached to feelings so strongly that they carry the feeling forever after. The kitchen garden grew. The fields went in. Biscuit the draft horse developed a fondness for Vrogash that expressed itself in the horse consistently trying to rest his enormous head on her shoulder, and she tolerated this with a resignation that Calvin found endlessly amusing. She wrote a letter to her cousin Prita. She showed it to Calvin before she sent it, not asking permission but sharing, which was different. The letter said that she had found her purpose in an unexpected place, that she was well, that she hoped Prita was well, and that she was not ready to come back to the Greywood but that she was not closed to it someday, and that she had found something that she had not known she was looking for. Calvin read it and handed it back. "That is a good letter. Prita will read between the lines," Vrogash said. "She is extremely perceptive. She will know there is a person involved." "Will that be all right?" Vrogash considered. "Prita will be cautious, but she will not judge. She was always the more flexible of us. She folded the letter. My brother Gort, on the other hand, will eventually need to be told, and that will be a more significant conversation. I would like to meet your brother someday, Calvin said, if he would permit it. Vrogash looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. He is not an easy man. I did not expect easy, Calvin said. I would like to meet the people who made you, the people who were your world before this. He paused. Because you matter to me, and the things that made you matter to me too. She held the folded letter for a moment very still. You are the most unexpectedly tender man I have ever met, she said. Calvin looked slightly embarrassed, which she had come to find deeply charming. I am a farmer, he said. We are not known for tenderness. No, she agreed. You are not. That is what makes it remarkable. The letter went out with Boris Callan on his next circuit, west and then south and then east toward the Greywood trade routes, and Vrogash and Calvin waited for what would come back. What came back was summer first. A blazing, abundant Veldmore summer that made the crops surge and the work multiply, and left them both browned by sun and perpetually tired in the way of people doing hard things they love. There was a day in July that Calvin would afterward consider one of the happiest of his life. An ordinary day, no particular occasion, just the two of them working in the field from mid-morning until the sun began its descent, and the particular quality of the light and the easy communication they had developed, a language of gesture and short phrase and understood context that came from months of shared work, and the way she sang that morning. The binding song, the Stormbound opening verse, sung quietly while she worked, for the first time since he had known her, low and rhythmic and beautiful in a way that his mother's poetry was beautiful, in the way of something that holds more than its surface. He did not say anything about it. He let it be. But he listened, and she knew he listened, and that knowing was its own kind of thing between them. In August, Preeta's reply arrived. It was longer than her first letter. It said many things. It said that Gort's position had softened further. It said the trade agreement had been formally dissolved after it produced a second unfavorable season, and that several elder council members had said, not officially, that Vrogash had been right to speak. It said that Preeta herself was curious, generous, and warm, and that the person Vrogash had mentioned, unnamed but clearly present in the letter, sounded like someone worth knowing. It said that whenever Vrogash was ready, the clan would hear her. Vrogash read this at the table with Calvin beside her, and when she set it down her eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before, and she looked up at the ceiling for a moment. You should go, Calvin said gently. She looked at him. What? To the Greywood. When you're ready, you should go and see them. He paused. It's yours, Vrogash. It was taken from you unjustly. You should go back and stand in it. I am not ready to go back, she said. Not yet, but she looked at him with those amber eyes. When I go, I want you to come with me. The weight of that settled over him like something precious placed in his hands. He took a moment with it. I'll need someone to watch Fig, he said. She laughed. The real laugh, the full one, tusks and warmth and everything. Marta Hensley loves dogs, Vrogash said. She does, Calvin agreed. She'll spoil him rotten. Good, Vrogash said. He deserves it. They decided to go to the Greywood the following spring, late spring, after the planting, and to stay for 1 month if Gort permitted it, and to see what followed. In the meantime, they had a farm to run and a winter to prepare for, and Vrogash had written back to Preeta, and the response was warmly received, and things with the Greywood were, for the first time, moving towards something instead of away from it. In September, Calvin rode to Ashwick. He had not gone in over a year. He went alone, deliberately, and he went with a specific purpose. He went to the small stone office of the land registrar on the main street, where the town records were kept, and he filed a partnership amendment to the Granger homestead property deed, adding Vrogash Stormbound as co-holder of the property in equal standing. The registrar was a thin, elderly man named Combe who had been doing this work for 40 years and had seen most things. He looked at the amendment. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the amendment again. This is legal, Combe said carefully. Frontier property law allows for— I know it's legal, Calvin said. I checked. That's why I'm filing it. Combe stamped the document with the particular resigned expression of a bureaucrat who has concluded that the world is going to do what it is going to do, and his job is simply to record it accurately. You understand this will be public record. Yes, Calvin said. That's the point. He rode home in the late afternoon light with the copy of the amended deed in his coat pocket. And when he arrived, Vrogash was on the porch with a mug of her terrible pine resin tea looking at the sunset over the barley fields, and Fig was at her feet. And the whole scene was so precisely the thing he wanted to come home to for the rest of his life that he sat on his horse for a moment just looking at it. She heard him, of course, and turned and raised an eyebrow. He dismounted, tied the horse, went up the porch steps and held out the folded deed. She took it, unfolded it, read it, a very long silence. "Calvin," she said. "It's your home," he said. "It should say so." She looked at the document for a long moment, this woman who had been told, technically and with the precise language of clan law, to find her purpose elsewhere. This woman who had pressed her hand against the frozen ground, seeking something solid. She looked at the document that said, in the dry official language of frontier property law, that this land, these 30 acres of workable Veldmore soil, belonged to Vrogash Stormbound equally and in full, and her jaw was very tight and her amber eyes were very bright. "You extraordinary man," she said quietly. He sat down beside her on the porch and she leaned against him, her shoulder to his, and they watched the sun go down over the barley fields together, and the document was folded carefully and set between them on the porch railing, and the evening came on soft and purple, and nothing needed to be said. That winter Calvin asked her to marry him. He did not have a ring. He had been thinking about this, and he had decided that what he wanted to offer was more specific than a ring. He wanted to offer the act of asking the right way, in the right moment, so he thought about it for 2 months, and on the night of the winter solstice, which in the Veldmore tradition was a night of renewal and beginning, he waited until they were both by the fire after supper with the snow coming down thick and soft outside, and the cabin entirely warm and full of the combined presence of everything they had built together. The herbs drying from the rafters that were hers, the surveying charts on the wall that were his, the shelf with 4 books and now 6 because she had added 2 of her own, the braided rug she had made in October from the scraps of worn cloth, Fig on his spot, the fire at its steady best. Calvin said, "I have been trying to find the right words for 2 months, and I have concluded that there probably are not perfect words for this, so I am going to say it plainly and trust that you will hear what I mean by it." Vrogash looked at him from her chair. She had the air of someone who has been quietly waiting for something and is now watching it arrive. "I want to be married to you," Calvin said. "In whatever form that means, if it means a frontier ceremony or a clan ceremony or both or neither, and just the 2 of us and a witness. I want you to be my partner in the deed and in the law and in everything else. I want to grow things with you for the rest of my life." He paused. "I want to hear the binding song every morning for the rest of my life. I want Fig to be insufferably spoiled by both of us until he is very old and very fat." He paused again. "I love you. I want to know if you will marry me." Vrogash sat with this for a long moment. She was very still, and in the firelight she was very beautiful, and Calvin sat across from her and waited with the patience of a man who knows that some things take the time they take, and rushing them helps nothing. "The Orc tradition," she said slowly, "does not have a ceremony quite like a human wedding. There is a binding promise. It is made in front of witnesses and it involves—" She paused. "There is a growl," she said with the slightest curve of a smile. "A formal one. It is the Orc word for declaration, for making something real." "I would like that," Calvin said. "We would need witnesses, and we would need the binding words which are in the old Orc tongue, and you would need to learn your part of them." She paused. "It is not a short ceremony." "I have time," Calvin said. The smile came fully then, both tusks and all the warmth behind them. "And the human ceremony?" "Whatever you want," he said. "Simple or elaborate, with Marta Hensley and Boris Callan as witnesses, or with the whole of Ashwick if you can stand them." "A small witness group," she said. Marta Hensley has been kind to me, and Boris Callan has never once looked at me with fear." "Then those two," Calvin said. Vrogash rose from her chair and crossed the hearth and stood before him, and she put her hands on either side of his face the way she had when she first told him she loved him. But this time she pulled him forward and pressed her forehead to his, orc style, the clan gesture of commitment, of two people becoming one weight. "Yes," she said. "Calvin Granger, yes." He put his hands over hers and held them there. "Good," he said. It was the same word he had used the night she agreed to stay through winter, and they both knew it and felt the echo of it, and it was better this time, fuller, carrying everything between then and now in its single syllable. They were married in April, before the planting, with Marta Hensley and Boris Callan as witnesses, in a double ceremony that was equal parts human frontier custom and orc binding promise. Vrogash had written to Prita months in advance, and Prita had sent back the binding words in both Old Orc script and Common Tongue phonetic transcription, along with a letter that made Vrogash laugh and cry in quick succession, and a small carved bone totem that was a stormbound wedding gift, ancient and worn smooth by generations of hands. The human ceremony was conducted by Marta Hensley, who had a lay preacher's license from the Frontier Settlement Council, and was brief and sincere. The orc ceremony was conducted by Vrogash herself, because there was no orc elder to do it, and she spoke the binding words in the old tongue with her hands in Calvin's and her voice low and steady and very full, and Calvin spoke his part haltingly but completely, having spent 3 weeks learning it, and when he got through the last line without error Vrogash made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughter. The formal growl, the declaration, was made at the ceremony's close, deep and resonant and felt in the chest, and Marta Hensley, who had not known to expect it, said afterward that it was the most moving thing she had ever heard at a wedding, and meant it entirely. They ate together on the porch with the spring coming in across the fields, the 4 of them around a table loaded with food, and the afternoon was warm and the conversation was good, and Fig received more scraps than was medically advisable, and it was a perfect day. That evening, after Marta and Boris had gone, Calvin and Vrogash sat on the porch steps in the last of the light, and she sang the binding song's opening verse, for the first time out loud and in his hearing, not quietly but properly, the full voice of it, and it rang across the Veldmore fields like something that had always belonged there, and was only now finding its right place. He held her hand and listened, and the last of the sun laid gold across everything. The years that followed were the good kind of years, not easy, but full, which is different and better. They expanded the farm. Calvin's barley operation grew through a combination of his methodical planning and Vrogash's ability to read soil and weather that went beyond anything in his almanac. She had a gift for it, a knowledge that came from growing up with the stormbound cattle lands, and she put it to work on the Granger fields with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. They added a second field in the 3rd year, 20 more acres on the northeast side, cleared together over the course of one backbreaking autumn, and added a dairy cow named Broad, who Vrogash named and was therefore insufferably fond of. The situation in Ashwick evolved gradually. Renner Dale continued to hold a low, slow disapproval for 2 full years and then, in the way of stubborn men who have run out of argument, simply stopped referencing it, and by the 4th year was buying Calvin's barley at a fair price, and had once, at the mill, nodded at Vrogash with something approaching respect when she had correctly identified a fungal problem in Renner's own grain storage that would have cost him considerably if left untreated. The young man with the clean coat, whose name turned out to be Ferris, and who had settled in Ashwick and opened a cooperage, became in time one of Calvin's regular trading partners and made no issue of anything. There were still people who looked at Vrogash with the assessing look, the is-she-dangerous look. This did not stop. Calvin had learned to live with the anger it produced in him, to bank it rather than burn with it, to choose his moments. Vrogash had spent a lifetime learning the same. They did not always agree on where those moments were. She tended toward patience past what he thought was warranted, and he sometimes acted on instinct where she would have preferred strategy. But they were honest about the disagreements and usually reached the same destination by slightly different routes. She went to the Greywood in the spring of their second year of marriage. Calvin went with her. It was an 11-day journey east, through the pine scrub and over the Keld Ridge by the low pass, and then down into the rolling grassland that opened into the ancient forest edge where the Stormbound had their primary camp. Vrogash grew quieter, and then more alive as they traveled, quieter as they left the familiar, more alive as the familiar changed to something older and more deeply hers. She pointed things out as they traveled, landmarks, particular rock formations, a spring that she said was the coldest water she had ever tasted, and he drank from it and agreed, and the cold of it went all the way through him like something clean. Preeta met them at the tree line. She was shorter than Vrogash, broader in the shoulder, with the same dark hair done in complex braids, and a face that was openly, warmly expressive in a way that immediately disarmed everything. She looked at Calvin with frank curiosity and no hostility, and then she opened her arms to Vrogash, and the sound Vrogash made when they embraced, a soft, broken sound, nothing like the controlled exhalations he knew. Something much more raw, was the most nakedly emotional sound Calvin had ever heard from her, and he stepped back 2 paces to give them space and looked at the tree line and felt his own throat close. Gort was harder. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and weathered, with more gray in his black hair than Calvin had expected for a man in his mid-30s, and he stood at the camp entrance with the stillness of someone who has rehearsed composure, and it showed in the effort. He looked at Calvin with the look of a man encountering something he has decided to reserve judgment on, and is finding that harder than he predicted. Calvin stepped forward and met Gort's eyes directly and said, "I know this is not easy. I am not asking for easy. I am asking for the chance to know the family of the woman I love and to be known by them and to see what happens from there." Gort said nothing for a moment. His amber eyes, the same amber as Vrogash's, Calvin realized, same striations assessed. "She spoke against me in council," Gort said finally, "and she was right. That is the hardest kind of right to acknowledge." "I know," Calvin said, "but you are acknowledging it, that counts." Another silence. Then Gort said, "She is well. She is extraordinary," Calvin said. Something shifted in Gort's face, the composed rehearsal fell away just slightly, and what was beneath it was love, recognizable and complicated and real. "She always was," he said quietly. "The month in the Greywood was not entirely smooth, but it was genuine. There were conversations that were difficult and conversations that were clarifying, and at least 3 where Calvin sat outside the tent, while Vrogash and Gort worked through years of compressed grief and anger and love in the old tongue. And Calvin sat in the Greywood dark, and listened to the forest sounds, and felt the weight and privilege of being allowed this close to something so private. There were also evenings around the clan fire that were extraordinary, the binding song sung in full, in rounds, the way she had described, every voice carrying a part, and Calvin hearing it whole for the first time and understanding in his bones why this was something she had been unable to sing in exile. He was, by the last week, cautiously welcomed. Not fully, not uniformly, there were clan members who remained uncertain, but by those who mattered most and by Gort himself, who on the final evening sat across the fire from Calvin and said without preamble, "Take care of her. She takes care of everyone. Someone should take care of her." "I know," Calvin said. "I am trying." Gort looked at the fire. "She told me you put her name on the land." "It's her home," Calvin said. Gort was quiet for a moment. "My father would have said that was the mark of a man who knows what things are worth." He paused. "My father was a wise man." "So was mine," Calvin said. They stayed the full month. They left in early summer, and Vrogash carried something home with her that had not been there before, not the weight she had set down when she left, but something more like the weight of completeness. the proper weight of a person who knows who they are and where they belong and does not have to choose between the two. She sang the binding song the whole first morning of the journey back, not quietly, properly. Calvin rode beside her and listened and thought he had never been so happy in his life. Their first child came in the autumn of the 3rd year of their marriage. Calvin had been, quietly and without saying so directly because he did not want to impose, hoping for children. Vrogash had spoken of it once, obliquely, saying that human-orc pairings were less common than they should perhaps be given how long the two peoples had coexisted, and that she had wondered sometimes about it. He had held this in his hands and been careful with it, and waited for her to bring it again. She brought it on an evening in early spring directly, the way she did everything. She asked him if he wanted children, and he said yes if she did, and she said yes, and that was the conversation. The pregnancy was harder than it might have been, not because of any catastrophic complication, but because frontier medicine was what it was and they were far from the best healers, and because half-orc pregnancies, as Prita had warned them in a letter full of practical information, ran longer than human ones and the final weeks were difficult. Marta Hensley came and stayed the last 3 weeks, sleeping in the loft, which she described as cozy, and which Calvin suspected she genuinely meant. The baby arrived on a clear October morning and was large and healthy, and startled the room with his first sound, which was less a cry than a full-throated declaration of presence. He had Vrogash's amber eyes and Calvin's gray ones competing in a way that had not resolved yet, showing as a warm hazel at birth that might go either direction. He had the very slight, very early suggestion of tusk structure in his lower jaw that would come into full prominence later, and he had Calvin's dark blonde hair, and he was the most beautiful thing either of his parents had ever seen, which is the universal truth of all new parents in all worlds, and was, in this case, also literally accurate. They named him Vrogash Stormbound Granger, for Calvin's father and for Vrogash's clan, and the name carried both things forward the way names at their best should do. Prita came for the naming ceremony, a 2-week journey she made without hesitation, and she held Aldrich with the particular competence of someone who had handled many babies, and she sang him the opening verse of the binding song in the old tongue, while he looked at her with the amber hazel eyes of a being who had not yet decided what the world was but was paying attention. Marta Hensley cried. Boris Callan, who had also come, did not cry but stood very straight and had to clear his throat several times. Gort sent a carved wooden token, the same clan marking that was on the wedding totem, along with a letter that said, in the spare way of a man learning to be less spare with his words, "I would like to meet him. Tell me when." They brought Aldrich to the Greywood the following summer, when he was 9 months old, and conducting himself with the bouncing, inquisitive energy of a small person who has recently mastered sitting and finds the world endlessly fascinating. Gort held him with the stunned expression of a man who has understood something intellectually and is now experiencing it viscerally, and Aldrich grabbed one of Gort's braids with the decisive grip of a child who has spotted something interesting and taken it. Gort looked at this child holding his braid and then up at Vrogash, and something in him broke open, quietly and completely. "He looks like you," Gort said. "He looks like both of us," Vrogash said. "Yes," Gort said. He held Aldrich a little closer. "Yes, he does." The second child came 4 years after the first, in a milder October, and was a girl who arrived so efficiently, and with such apparent purposefulness that Marta Hensley said she had never attended a birth where she was less needed and more impressed. They named her Stormbound Granger, for Vrogash's mother, and she had dark green-gray skin exactly like Vrogash's and Calvin's gray eyes exact, and she slept through anything and was serene from the very first hour, and watched the world with a stillness that was already, at days old, entirely her own. Aldrich, at 4 years old, regarded his sister with the complex mix of territorial suspicion and nascent protectiveness that is the universal condition of firstborn children, and within 2 weeks, had appointed himself her primary guardian from threats that existed only in his imagination, and which he took extremely seriously. Fig, by then quite old and quite deaf and quite round, slept beside the children's beds without being asked to, and woke with irritable reliability whenever either of them cried. Life was full and hard and wonderful in the specific way of a life that is genuinely being lived. The year Aldrich turned 7, he asked his mother about the binding song. He had grown up hearing it every morning or most mornings, the opening verse, but had never asked specifically about it, in the way children absorb things that are simply part of the texture of life before they begin to ask what the texture means. That morning at breakfast, with his green-gray half-forked chin resting on his hands and his hazel eyes on his mother across the table, he asked. Vrogash told him the whole story. She told him about the Stormbound, about the Greywood, about the first storm of the world and the ancestors who ran into it. She told him it was a binding song because it bound the clan together, each person to every other across time and distance, so that the clan was not only the people alive in it at any given moment, but all the people who had ever been stormbound and all the people who would ever be. Aldrich listened with Calvin's quality of listening, which is to say completely and without fidgeting. "Are we stormbound?" he asked. "You are Stormbound Granger," Vrogash said. "Both things equally. Can I sing it?" "When you know it," Vrogash said, "I will teach you." She began teaching him that evening, the opening verse, syllable by syllable, and Calvin sat at the table with little Dura on his knee, and listened to his wife teach his son the words of her people's oldest song, the sound of it filling the cabin that had once held only him and a half-deaf dog, and a quiet loneliness that he had almost stopped noticing before it stopped being true. He had a moment, very full, that came without warning the way the fullest moments do. He pressed his lips to the top of Dura's head, and she grabbed a fistful of his shirt, as she always did when in arms, a habitual claiming that he found consistently wonderful. Vrogash looked up from Aldrich and across the table at Calvin. He must have had the expression on his face, the one she had learned to read over years, the one that meant he was feeling something too large for comfortable words. She held his gaze for a long moment, amber eyes warm, and he saw in her face everything they had made together and were making still, and she gave him the look she reserved for these moments, the one that contained years of mornings and harvests and hard seasons and good ones, and the deed with both names on it, and the binding promise in the old tongue, and a child, named for his father, and a child, named for her mother, and a half-deaf dog who had been the first to accept what they were building. Then she turned back to teaching Aldrich the binding song. Calvin sat and listened and held his daughter and was exactly where he was supposed to be. By the time Aldrich was 10 and Dura was 6, the farm had grown to a small operation of 60 acres, with a second barn and a hired hand named Torben who was 17 and from Ashwick, and who had been sent by his family to learn farming, and had not initially known how to address Vrogash, and had solved this problem by one day, without announcement, simply calling her Mrs. Stormbound Granger, which she had looked at him for a moment about and then accepted. He was a good worker, and he liked the children, and Fig approved of him, which was the metric that mattered. Ashwick itself had changed in the decade-plus since Calvin had ridden there to file the property amendment. The town had grown along with the frontier, and growth had a way of smoothing out the sharper edges of old prejudices, or at least repositioning them, because growth required cooperation, and cooperation required seeing people as useful, and useful people were harder to dismiss. Vrogash had served twice on the informal Frontier Settlement Council, the body that managed road maintenance and dispute resolution and emergency aid in the wider Veldmore region, and her knowledge of land, weather, and practical problem-solving had made her so consistently valuable that even the most resistant members of that council had been reduced to the position of privately grateful while publicly grudging, which was the best anyone could reasonably expect in a single generation. She was known. She was respected, even by those who did not use the word. She was Vrogash Stormbound Granger of the Granger homestead, and when people in Ashwick said that name, they said it with the weight that belongs to names that have become landmarks. Calvin was proud of this. He was also proud in the simpler, more private way of a man who has watched the person he loves become fully themselves in the world they built together, and who knows that his part in that was only possible because she was already everything she needed to be. He told her this on a specific evening, a November evening in the year Aldrich turned 10, when the children were in bed and the fire was low and they were sitting together on the old porch expanded now, with a proper railing that Vrogash had insisted on when Dura learned to run, in the autumn cold with blankets across their legs, the way they often spent their evenings now, quiet and close. "I want to tell you something," he said. She turned her head, looked at him. "I know I am not always the most expressive man in the world," he said. "I know I am sometimes. I have always communicated better with work than words. I know this," she said. "It has never been a problem. I want to use words tonight," he said. "I want to tell you you are the best thing in my life. You are the best thing that has ever happened on this farm, and you are the best person I know, and I am aware that I say these things too rarely and I want them to be said properly." Vrogash was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "You say them constantly," she said softly. "You say them every morning when you check the sky and start the fire. You say them every time you let me make decisions about the farm without making it a negotiation. You said them when you put my name on the deed." She paused. "You say them in 100 ways that are not words, but the words are also good." She turned back to look at the dark fields. "I love you, Calvin. I loved you when you lifted a fence post off a stranger who might have been anything, and I have loved you every day since, and I love you more now than I knew I was capable of loving anyone." The November night was cold and clear, and the stars over the Veldmore frontier were extraordinary, as they always were in the clear nights, out here away from town and lamplight. Calvin put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat and watched the stars over the farm that was theirs, under a sky that belonged to no one and everyone equally. "Do you ever miss the Greywood?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Less than I used to. It's in me wherever I am. That's what the binding song means, really. You cannot be separated from where you belong because where you belong travels with you." She paused. "But I also belong here. I belong to this porch and these fields and this ridiculous old dog." She glanced through the window at Fig, visible as a large dark shape in front of the hearth. "And to those children, and to you. You belong to yourself first," Calvin said, "before any of those things." She turned and looked at him again. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right. And that," she touched his face, the familiar gesture, both hands warm and strong. "That is why I have never stopped being grateful that it was you who lifted that fence post." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. "It means I'm keeping you," she had said, all those years ago, on a winter night by the fire with the emberglow on her face. She had kept him, and he had kept her. And keeping, he had come to understand, was not the possessive thing it sounded like when said by the wrong people in the wrong way. Keeping was something else entirely. Keeping was the daily, chosen, active commitment to hold something precious and tend it and make it possible for it to grow. Keeping was what you did with the things that mattered most. Fig died in the late winter of that year, very old and very fat and very comfortable, in his spot by the hearth, in his sleep, with no apparent complaint about any of it. Aldrich cried. Dura was stoic in the particular stoic way she approached most things, but she sat beside Fig's spot for a long time that evening, and eventually Calvin sat with her and she leaned against him and said, "He always knew when I was sad. He would come and put his head in my lap." "He was very good at that," Calvin agreed. "I am glad he was happy," Dura said with 6-year-old gravity. "He was," Calvin said. "He was very happy." They buried Fig in the corner of the kitchen garden, where he had enjoyed lying in the sun through the warm months, and Aldrich made a small carved marker for him, his first proper woodworking project, and the marking read, "Fig, Granger farm dog, who was deaf in one ear and loved everyone regardless. There were other dogs after, because a farm needs dogs and children need them more. But Fig's marker stayed, and the kitchen garden grew around it, and Vrogash planted something that bloomed yellow in summer near the spot, because Fig had always seemed to like the yellow flowers best. The Greywood visits became an annual thing, summer when possible or autumn, and Gort became, over years, a man who had worked through enough of himself to be genuinely warm when he chose to be. And he chose to be often with Aldrich and Dura, who called him Uncle Gort without hesitation, and whose orc heritage he took responsibility for teaching, in the practical way of someone ensuring that a clan does not lose its knowledge just because some of its people have ranged far. Aldrich, at 12, learned the full binding song. He sang it in the Greywood at the summer gathering, in front of the clan fire in the old tongue, in a voice that was still a boy's voice but carried the song's weight properly. And the clan heard it and responded with the round singing, other voices picking up each part. And Vrogash stood beside Calvin in the firelight with her hand in his and her face turned upward slightly and her amber eyes very bright. And she did not wipe the tears that came, and Calvin did not either. Dura, at 8, gave her first clan name claim in the old tongue, speaking who she was and who her people were, and she did it with the particular composure that was entirely her own, and that already, in someone so young, felt like the composure of a person who knows exactly where they stand in the world and is prepared to defend it if necessary. The years continued. There were hard ones, a blight year that took half the barley and required careful management of reserves, and the pulling of a debt from the Ashwick grain house, repaid in full within 2 seasons. A late frost in the spring of Aldrich's 14th year that killed the early planting and meant starting again, and they started again. A summer illness that took Marta Hensley, who had been part of their lives from the beginning, and whose loss was genuine and wide felt, and whose grave in Ashwick had flowers from the Granger farm on it every spring without fail. And there were good ones, Torben, their hired hand, growing into a young man who started his own small farm on the North Ridge, and came to them for advice with the frequency and comfort of someone coming home. A delegation from the Frontier Settlement Council that, in the 15th year, asked Vrogash to serve as a standing representative, a formal position, and she served for 6 years and was a better council member than most of the humans who had held the post, and this became, gradually, so understood that it stopped being remarkable. Aldrich, at 18, left for a season to travel east, to spend time in the Greywood, and came back with the calm assurance of a young man who has gone looking for something and found it, though he could not have said precisely what it was. He was very like his father in the quality of his attention, and very like his mother in the directness of his speech, and in the bone-deep physical confidence of someone who has always inhabited their body as a working thing. He had the slight tusk structure that had come in fully around 15, and he was proud of it, and Calvin had said, when Aldrich was 15 and uncertain about it, that it was part of what made him exactly who he was, and that anyone worth knowing would see it that way. And Aldrich had looked at his father for a long moment, and then nodded once, the decisive nod of someone settling something internally. Dura, at 16, took up the land surveying charts from the shelf in the cabin. She had been reading them since she could hold a book, but at 16 she began to actually use them, walking the farm's boundaries and the neighboring land with a precision that suggested she was headed somewhere specific with the knowledge. She was, it turned out. She had decided she wanted to expand the farm in a particular direction, and had worked out the surveying geometry necessary to determine the optimal boundary adjustment, and presented this to her parents at supper one evening with a thoroughness that left them both slightly stunned. They made the adjustment the following spring. Dura was 17. The new field was planted with a rye variety she had researched specifically, and it did very well. The cabin had been expanded over years into a proper farmhouse. 2 additional rooms, a full enclosed porch, a stone chimney replacing the original clay and wood one, a proper cold cellar dug by Calvin and Vrogash and Aldrich in a summer that became one of their shared family memories primarily because they managed it with very little conflict and a great deal of laughter, which was not the experience they had expected of digging a cold cellar. The property deed had been amended twice more over the years, adding Torben's northeast parcel arrangement and then the south boundary adjustment, and the original amendment, the one with both names, Calvin Granger and Vrogash Stormbound Granger, filed by a man who rode to Ashwick alone in September and filed it because it was the right thing, and it was the point sat in the property box with the others, still the first document in the stack, worn slightly at the folds. Vrogash had looked at it one afternoon when she was going through the property papers for the boundary adjustment, and she had held it for a moment, the original, and she looked up at Calvin across the kitchen table and said, "I remember thinking when you gave this to me that no one had ever done anything quite so." She paused, looking for the word. "So specifically right. I had to know the law very carefully first," Calvin said. Combe the registrar was not enthusiastic. "Combe the registrar," Vrogash said, "is a man who made his peace with it and in his way I think even came around." She set the paper down carefully. "There is something in this document that I have never been able to articulate properly. It is not just the property. It is the deliberateness of it. You thought about it and you decided and you rode all the way to Ashwick and filed it without asking me first because you knew what it meant and you wanted me to have it. Not because it was required, because you understood what it would mean." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Then you pressed your hand against the ground in my barley field looking for something solid. I wanted to give you something solid that would not go away." Vrogash looked at him. "You remember that," she said. "I remember everything," he said simply. She stood up from the table and walked around it and took his face in her hands, and she pressed her forehead to his. And the gesture they had made on the night she said yes to marrying him was all the fuller now for everything it had accumulated over years of repeating. And they held it for a long moment in the kitchen of the farmhouse that was theirs and smelled of the morning's tea, and the drying herbs and the bread Dura had put in to bake before she went out to the fields. "Calvin Granger," she said softly against his forehead. "Vrogash Stormbound Granger," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for lifting the fence post." He laughed, and she felt it against her face, and she smiled with it. Tusks and warmth and 20-some years of evenings and mornings and storms run into and fields worked and children raised and songs sung and a life, a full and real and irreplaceable life, built from the ground up on a 30-acre plot of Veldmore frontier soil. "Thank you," he said, "for staying after the storm." They stood in their kitchen in the morning light, and outside the fields were green with spring, and somewhere in those fields their daughter was surveying land with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what was worth keeping, and their son was riding back from Ashwick with grain supplies and news, and the farmhouse was warm and full and right, and everything that had been open was closed, and everything that had been missing had been found, and everything that had been built was solid and true and theirs. The day that had started once in a frost-cold barley field with an injured woman who pressed her hand against the ground looking for something solid, had become this, a life, a family, a legacy of 2 peoples woven together into something neither world could have made alone, a farm with 2 names on the deed, children who carried both songs, fields that had been worked by hands of green-gray and rough pink, season after season, until the land knew them both and gave back accordingly. The binding song was sung every morning on the Granger farm, and had been for 20 years, and would be for years more, sometimes by Vrogash alone in the quiet before the household woke, sometimes by all 4 of them at the table, sometimes by Aldrich in the fields, carrying it forward as it had been carried for generations, and as it would continue to be carried, across all the distances that separate people from each other, across all the storms that try the world. by the people who choose to run into those storms together rather than away from them alone, which is, in the end, the only thing the binding song was ever about.